just spend a couple of minutes talking about, as that frightening picture suggests, the changing media environment, because it certainly is changing. We all know that. We know how we are consuming media. So I want to talk a little bit about that, and then open it up to your thoughts and your questions as well, because I really do think that there is the way journalism is shifting has an impact on our lives, but also, I will argue, it has an impact on the democracy that this United States is founded on. But I want to begin and end my presentation with two stories from my life which illustrate, I think, how media is changing. As you suggested, I teach classes at Alverno College here in Milwaukee. One of the classes I teach is a journalism class. And my students are mostly 20-something women who attend the class. And I always ask them the very first night, how do you get your news? I typically hear the internet. More specifically, Facebook, Twitter. Now remember, these are women who signed up for a class in journalism. And they're saying they get their news from Twitter and Facebook. They cannot relate to my experience growing up in a house where my brother and I were my dad's remote control, because there were no remote controls. And of course, we only had 4 channels to pick from. We, of course, did our homework consulting encyclopedias that were decades old, what I wouldn't have given for Google. But while fully admitting my age, I've seen just in my lifetime some pretty dramatic changes. My family, when I was growing up, subscribed to 2 newspapers every day, a morning newspaper, an afternoon newspaper. They were delivered to our homes, and we consumed them. Milwaukee's still pretty lucky. We have 1 daily newspaper that's still available to us. Some cities don't even have a daily newspaper. Major cities don't have newspapers that are being published every day in their community. The Pew Center's Project for Excellence in Journalism tracks changes in the media. They issue a report every year, and this year's report shows a lot of negatives, with one exception. There was one area that saw growth in media consumption: digital platforms. The proliferation of digital devices seems to be a big part of the reason. In 2012, total traffic to the top 25 news sites increased by more than 7%. And 39% of all respondents say they got their news online, either online or on a mobile device. Cable television. There were signs in 2012 that there is a ceiling for the cable news audience in this country, even in a presidential election year, in which really cable TV and the news channels excel. Total median viewership increased by only 1% across the major news channels on cable television. All of the major news magazines are declining in audience as well. Sales of newsstand copies, which is sort of the benchmark for the industry, plummeted by 16% on average for news magazines in the last year. In the evening, network television newscasts average about 22 million people a year. They watched either the lightning news on ABC, CBS, or NBC. But that's about a 2% decrease from the previous year. By the way, some people call that nightly newscast, with Brian Williams or the others, old man news. Young people don't watch it. And if you don't believe me, count the number of commercials for Cialis. Local television news has also lost audience, including ours that had gained audience in previous years. Now you might wonder why the local TV stations do so much local news. Local news starting at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning for a few hours, and then a few more hours in the late afternoon, and news at 10. Well, the reason for that is because the local stations get to keep all of the advertising revenue. So that local news is actually a profit center for the local TV stations, even though fewer and fewer people are watching it. So if you talk about newspapers, now this is the area which I think we would all pretty much agree has dramatically changed. How many people subscribe to newspapers? Anybody? See, I proved my point. But chances are you're very well informed because you can find the news in other ways. But here's the factor. As American newspapers have lost circulation, the number of journalists that those newspapers can employ has also declined. So many observers would argue that the death spiral for newspapers began with the loss of classified advertising. But think about it. If you want to sell your car, are you going to put an ad in the newspaper? Or are you going to put it on Craigslist? That's what most people are doing these days. So the advertising revenue that the Journal-Sentinel and other newspapers have received traditionally is gone. Let's say you want to apply for a job. Are you going to look for that ad in the Journal-Sentinel? No, chances are you're going to go online and go to monster.com or one of the other many online job sites. Well, that has cost newspapers a lot of money. And so they have had to lay off a lot of journalists. Print advertising fell for a 6th consecutive year in 2012, and not just by a little, it dropped by about $2 billion, over 8.5% in a very slowly moving, improving economy. So think back to my class of those young women and where they get their news. Now, I had a woman in my class just this year, as a matter of fact, who said that she believed that everything on the internet should be free. And I asked her why. And she said, well, it's always been that way. And I can't blame her, because in her lifetime, that's the way it has happened. But when I asked her if that had an impact in the way journalists or newspapers or those news sites could cover the news, she said, no, of course not. But what she didn't think about was that it's the pay sites, like the Journal-Sentinels, New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, that it's trying to keep newspapers afloat. It's a new revenue source. But a lot of people really do have the position that the news on the internet should be free. And they say, you know, if I can't access the site from the Journal-Sentinel, I'll just go to Google News. I'll go to Yahoo News. And they do. Sites like the Drudge Report, Google News, Yahoo News, and many others like that are immensely popular. But they don't have their own reporters. They merely aggregate the news from those other news sources. It's not a bad business model for something like the Drudge Report when you think about it. But as that plays out, here's the question. Who's left to cover the news? Who will gather the news in the future? Judging by a string of buyouts and layoffs at many American newspapers, it's predicted that within the next year there will be about another 1,000 journalists that will lose their job in American newspapers again this year. That would take the industry below 40,000 newsroom employment for the first time since 1978. It's down 30% since the year 2000. So let's think about that a moment. Newspapers around America have seen a decline of 30% of their journalists since the year 2000 alone. They are closing bureaus all around the world and domestic bureaus as well. Who's left to gather the news? The situation is actually even worse at radio and television stations around the country. When I was a reporter in Milwaukee at a Milwaukee radio station going back to the 1970s, the mayor would call a news conference, and I'd be there along with reporters from the 2 major newspapers, from the 3 or 4 TV stations in town, several radio stations. Everybody would show up. Now, when one of our reporters from our radio station shows up at a news conference, there might be a TV station there, and there might be one newspaper reporter there. Radio stations, like WTMJ Radio, primarily get their news from their TV station. They don't have their own radio reporters. For many years, the local news that you heard on WISN radio, between Rush Limbaugh and Mark Belling, didn't even originate in Milwaukee. The local news on WISN radio was being originated in Cleveland. because Clear Channel, which owns those stations, decided it would be cheaper to have one person in Cleveland read the wire service copy in Cleveland and feed it to all their stations around the country. So who was left to cover the news in Milwaukee? So why should we even care about this? We're still getting our news. I'd like to argue that these changes are not good for our democracy. Fewer reporters mean fewer people to keep their eyes on government. If you don't have a reporter at City Hall, who will report on what takes place there? Now, in recent years, as I'm sure many of you know, conservative call-in radio shows have become all the rage. But those talk show hosts will admit that they have a bias. They're going to tell you what they think about the news. They will skew the news to align with their political bias. Now, that's not journalism. I'm not faulting them, by the way, because they are incredibly successful. But they are entertaining their audience. They will only uncover the news that suits their viewpoint. Even if you think that Barack Obama is the worst president ever, can you think of one good thing that he has done? Probably. Yet will Rush Limbaugh ever talk about that? I doubt it. Will Mark Belling ever criticize Governor Scott Walker? Pretty unlikely. So that's not journalism. Now, if Rush and Mark Belling were here, they would say that my station, the NPR public radio station in Milwaukee, is also biased. They would say that NPR leans left. I would say, prove it. In fact, that's the typical slam on newspapers, TV, and radio stations by conservative talk show hosts these days. They talk about the traditional media as having a liberal bias. Now, you can make up your own mind. But I'm going to tell you this. I've sat in a lot of editorial meetings for different radio and TV stations, and I have a lot of friends in the newspaper business. Everyone will tell you, and it's been my observation, that nobody sits in these meetings and advocates for their bias on a story. In fact, in literally every news meeting that I have ever sat in, the discussion is, how can we present a wide variety of views? Some of those views might make us feel a little uncomfortable, but it's important to get that information out there. Yeah, the Journal-Sentinel takes an editorial stance on its editorial pages, but not on their news pages. So I want to talk, before I open this up to questions and any discussion you want to have, I just want to talk a few minutes about my radio station, WUWM Milwaukee Public Radio. In case you aren't aware, WUWM is Milwaukee's NPR station. We air a little bit more than 20 hours of news every day, news produced by our own journalists covering southeastern Wisconsin, from NPR and from the BBC in London. We have the largest staff of radio journalists of any radio or TV station in this community. We've actually seen our audience grow dramatically over the years as other news outlets have seen their audience decline. We have a full-time environmental reporter. We cover the news from the state capitol. We look at how legislation will impact this community. We believe, and our listeners hopefully will continue to agree, that we're playing an important role in informing the community. A former pastor at my church used to say he never wanted to tell us what to think, only to give us something to think about. And that's really our philosophy in public radio and at WUWM. So I began my presentation by thinking back to how I was my dad's remote control for the TV set. And to illustrate how things have changed, I want to tell you, I want to wrap it up with another personal story from my life, which I think will demonstrate just how things have changed. And I reflect upon a conversation I had with my son. At the time he was in his 20s, he was off at college, and he came home for Thanksgiving or some holiday. And he woke up in the morning, and I was sitting downstairs and I was reading the newspaper, actually holding a newspaper in my hand. And he looked at me and he said, half in jest, "How quaint, they print the internet for you." Yeah, things are changing. Thank you very much for your time. I'd be very happy to answer your questions or to just hear your observations about how you're consuming media differently, or where do you think this goes in the future. Thank you very much.
I don't know if this is a question as much as a comment. You're talking about biasness, and I think a lot of my generation is frustrated with like Fox Network and only constantly getting one side of the story. And I think that kind of is what led them towards getting things on the internet, because they have more ability of finding what it is that they're looking for.
Sure.
You know, like my husband and I, we watch MSN and we watch BBC, you know, to try and get a more variety of news, you know, because this country is so focused on this way or this way, nothing in between, and
Yes.
nothing outside of what's going on here. And I think a lot of people are really frustrated by that, and I don't know what you think, if you think improving that could bring back more of the, if it's possible for media to turn back. And to
Well, I don't know. It's hard to predict what's going to happen 10 years from now, because we're going to get news differently. It's going to continue to evolve. But I think you do raise a couple of really good points. First of all, some news channels, both radio and TV, have now figured out that there's a huge audience for, let's say, conservative opinion. So you have Fox, and you have Rush Limbaugh, and you have WISN Radio, and those kind of shows. And they do very, very well. They've tapped into a real interesting vein of the American population. And then you have MSNBC, which started out as a news organization linked to NBC, and it was going to be straight down the middle of the road, and nobody watched them. So they gradually became kind of the liberal voice. And I think that what happens here is that we all have so many more choices, and we all know that everywhere. And I think we have to be smarter consumers. I think that the days of getting one newspaper that's going to have everything, or one, pardon me, I'm showing my age, Walter Cronkite news at night, I think that era is gone. I think we're going to be more and more like what you're describing. You're going to watch the BBC, you're going to watch a network news show, you're going to read a newspaper, and you're not going to believe everything that you read. And I think that we all, just as we have to be smart consumers when we buy a car or we go to the grocery store, we've got to be smart consumers about journalism. And I think we always have to ask ourselves, is there a bias? Or get a lot of different points of view, and then make up your own mind what you think about an issue. But I don't know. I don't think you can put toothpaste back in the tube. And but I think it's going to continue to evolve. But it is going to force all of us to be a little bit more savvy, just savvier when we are consuming journalism and consuming media, to decide if what we're hearing is accurate. And there's a lot of great accurate sources out there. I'd like to think my station is one, and NPR, BBC, there's plenty of other wonderful sources. But you've got to seek it out a little bit more. Yeah. Yes?
I know it's hard to vision that from this point, but the social networks are really growing in a huge pace. I heard about the young guy. He just made a new type of messaging system, which goes to your phone and then disappears.
Right.
Apparently it was something valuable to many people, and the Facebook owners offered $3 billion.
And he turned it down.
Yeah, and he returned it down. So,
right.
How do you see the media should utilize the social networks? I mean, how do you see that? For example, I'm getting breaking news from CNN's Twitter.
Right.
Well,
I actually think that's good. I mean, I really do think it's good. And I'm on, I have Twitter sources, and I'm on Facebook, and I'm consuming a lot of different things. And I think it's good that we're connected at a faster pace and we know what's going on. But Twitter is 140 characters, right? You're never going to get much depth behind that 140 characters. And I think we have a responsibility to dig deeper. There's another danger that does concern me a little bit, and that is there is a desire now on the part of news organizations, because of Twitter feeds and now it's a 24/7 news cycle, that people report things quickly before they actually investigate it. And so a lot of rumor becomes reported as fact, and that's dangerous. And there have been instances just recently where stories have been rolled out on Twitter by legitimate news organizations, and they've turned out to be wrong. Information that was coming out just last week about the shooting at children's hospitals. There was a lot of information that came out that was wrong.
Yeah, they didn't check their sources.
They didn't check their sources. They reported a rumor because somebody said, we got to get that story out on Twitter. In the old days, not that many decades ago, the reporters would talk to everybody, go back to the newsroom, write a story that would be vetted by an editor, and then it would be printed at night and you would read it in the morning. Well, now the expectation, and I have it too, is that all I got to do is pull up my phone and I'm going to know everything about what's going on right now. Again, it goes back to the point where I think as there is more information available to us, we have to be better consumers. And we have to ask ourselves the question, are we really getting the full truth in that 140 characters? Yes?
It isn't only the truth, but assessment of information. We get information in raw format.
Yes.
So I may see that there's a traffic going on this direction and another this direction and the other way around, but I may not see the big pictures. I just see the traffic bars along
Right.
the way. And what is the implication for me? I may not be well aware of the implications.
Mhm.
And it may influence not only me, but also how I behave and how I treat others. In the sense that I come from Oklahoma, that's what we see all the time there, in the sense that there's a certain way, certain channels that people typically watch. They're not NPR.
Right.
And they are worried about things that are not, that's not there. I mean, and for example, people are afraid of Islam, and they pass laws against
Right.
Islam all of a sudden, which is not a threat there at all. So, do you see that this type of news may polarize people more in the future?
Sure. If you watch the news at night, the lead story is usually what people pay most attention to, the first story of the night. And there used to be a saying, and I think it's still probably used, if it bleeds, it leads. Because people want tension, they want something, what's going on right now. And if you watch the news at night, or even if you pick up the newspaper, you may hear a lot of stories about a crime that's committed in a particular neighborhood or in a particular location, or people who are getting arrested. But that doesn't get to the issue. It doesn't get to what's really behind that story. So for example, on our station, on WUWM, we've actually formed a partnership with Milwaukee Public Television, and over the course of the next few months, we're looking at an issue that I think is largely being ignored in this community. There was a report out some time ago, and I think it came out of the state, that said that, no, it was a national report, I take that back, and it said that of all of the major metropolitan areas of the United States, Milwaukee has the greatest percentage of African American males who are incarcerated. And that was the story. It was just out there. Our newsroom said, why? And we found out that it's really complicated. It's very layered. It has a lot to do with the criminal justice system. It a lot has to do with the laws. It has a lot to do with education. So we're going to, over the course of the next several months, work with Milwaukee Public Television on getting to the root causes of that. And I think that if you just read a headline and you make an opinion, you form an opinion, whether it's about Islam or it's about anything else, you're reactionary. And I think that we have to take the time to really say, so what's really behind this story? And you've got to find the news sources that are willing to give you, you know, more than that reactionary coverage. Yes?
I wanted to return to the comment that you made about threats to our democracy under the current media environment, and I guess to sort of highlight how being an informed consumer of information isn't going to solve a lot of really critical issues. And I'm thinking in particular about local news coverage and about how just a couple of years ago my husband happened to attend one of the school board meetings. It was a very contentious meeting about the budget, and we were going through a lot of budget negotiations. And it just so happened he was sitting next to the reporter, the Milwaukee Sentinel reporter, who covers education all the time. And I think, you know, the value of the Milwaukee Sentinel reporter being there, whatever you think about the point of view of that newspaper, is that this is a guy who's been doing this for a long time. He has established a network of communication with, you know, people in the education system in Milwaukee that no citizen here is going to easily replicate that.
Correct.
So when you're talking about, you know, trying to weed through information and make informed decisions, I mean, the reality is that, first of all, the loss of a lot of the journalists that you're talking about means that certain local beats, very important ones, aren't going to be covered. And that to really understand what's going on and to know a lot of these complex institutions requires access to a lot of these people, and sort of a long-standing involvement in a historical and social context that is going to be beyond really the average citizen, right? And it's not because we're stupid, it's not because we don't know what we're
You
doing,
don't have the
but
network.
we're not going to have that kind of access, and we're not going to have the time to invest,
Right.
none of us are, to understand those kinds of institutional arrangements.
You're absolutely right. But when you're losing that many journalists from not only the Journal Sentinel